I should have switched it over to a different Wi-Fi. Okay, well, we're starting a little bit late. This is the lowest. I'm not going to say it. Anyways, I'm so glad you're here.
Yeah, there you go.
So glad everyone's here. Would anybody like to pray to start us?
I will.
Thank you, Shane.
Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the study that we're doing. And Father, just help us to hear what we need to hear and to learn and to understand and to remember. And Father, we just thank you for all your blessings that we're learning, everything we're learning about what you have done for us over the years. And we just praise you and we thank you. And we thank you for this beautiful, wonderful day. And we ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Sharon. Okay, well, last time we read up through chapter 32. We didn't finish chapter 32. Because we kind of went through that whole story of Jacob going up way into the north, way up, going way up here. Or let's see if it closed it. Of course it did. I was going to show you on the map here. He went way up into the north to go to escape his brother Esau, remember, because he had stolen his birthright and blessing. Went up to where Abraham and his family had really started out and found his wives, what came to be his four wives. Started out wanting Rachel, then got tricked into marrying Leah, and then married Rachel, and then ended up basically taking on both of their women servants as wives as well.
It's kind of crazy to me.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I don't want that.
They still got in trouble.
Yeah. So I guess here's a map of basically his travels. Originally, he went from down here all the way up here into the north. I don't know if you can see my mouse. I'll try and make this big. Okay, I shouldn't have done that. Okay. So yeah, he went from down here, this is Israel right here on the eastern border of the Mediterranean Sea. And he went all the way up here into the north. I don't know where this would be. My guess is this is like Iran, roughly.
Oh, in present day.
Present day Iran. Back then, I don't know what that kingdom would have been. And then, so he goes up there, spends 20 years with Laban, his uncle, in order to earn his two wives and his flock. But then he ends up stealing away. He takes all of his stuff and his wives and goes away before Laban can catch him. And Laban catches him up. And there's Rachel steals the household god, and they have that whole episode. And then basically they agree to disagree. Jacob says, you cheated me so many times, and I'm taking my stuff. And Laban says, well, none of this is your stuff. Your wives belong to me, your flock belongs to me. But, basically it sounds like they were so clear in their disagreement that it was going to come to, I can hear his ear from here. Poor guy. Oh, man. I'm being too loud. That's better. But, so, basically it seems to me, because Laban comes down with his men. And it's kind of like a confrontation, and we don't know, but it kind of seems like it either would have had to turn violent, or Laban would have tried to take his stuff by force, or what they did do was he just says, okay, guess we're just going to make a covenant here, and they agree to not. They put up a memorial, and they agree that anytime they see that memorial, a heap of stones, neither of them will cross into each other's land to do war or to harm the other. So
why would you disagree with him? Why couldn't he leave when he fulfilled his duties to him? Why couldn't he leave when he wanted to?
Well, I think the implication is Laban has cheated Jacob many times. Yeah. He's given terms, like they've agreed on terms, like the first agreement they made was that he would serve him for 7 years for Rachel. And then he cheated him, right, with Leah. And then, he gets the two wives, but then when he agrees to serve for the flock, we find out it's kind of hard to track, but basically Laban cheats Jacob multiple times with the flock.
Right. So why couldn't he leave when he wanted to?
So I think what Jacob
He
learned,
needed money.
well, what Jacob learns is that he can't trust Laban. They can make an agreement that he'll serve him for so long and then he'll be able to leave or something like that. But Laban isn't trustworthy. He's going to keep on cheating him to keep him there and keep on, because what's clear is when Jacob is there, Laban is blessed. Everything multiplies. And that's what God promised, that God promised to Abraham and to Jacob, whoever blesses you, I will bless. And whoever curses you, I will curse. Isaac blessed Jacob with the same blessing. And so, because Jacob stays with Laban, Laban experiences blessing. So he's got a selfish motive to keep Jacob there as long as possible.
That stuff isn't all his. The wives are his.
Well, but Rachel and Leah are his daughters.
Yeah,
and
his wives.
Sure. So in the ancient world, this is good, Rita. Thank you. In the ancient world, it worked differently from our society. You had a patriarchal society. That means at the top of every family was a patriarch, the man of not just the immediate family. It was normally up to roughly 3 generations in one household. Parents, or like grandparents, parents, and grandchildren, and male and female slaves and animals, all living like on a homestead. Sometimes even the cattle living inside the house on the first floor, to provide heating for the whole house and to protect the animals. So in this one house, sometimes within one building, you would have 3 generations of people and animals all living together. And the man at the top, the patriarch, was responsible for the whole house, and he basically owned everybody in the house. So when his daughters got married off, it was also as far as I understand it, it was kind of a transaction of property. So the daughter was not only considered property, but she was treated as property in a transaction. So if a man married a woman, often she came into his household. But this situation seems to have been murky, because Jacob stays with Laban, and it seems that he kind of operates under Laban's authority.
Yeah.
Because he's serving him and he's staying within his household while he's there with him. So it's kind of a murky thing, because Jacob isn't really a slave of Laban's, so he doesn't own him like a slave. And normally what would happen is a man would marry the daughters and they would go off and start their own household. But in this case, Jacob stayed with Laban. So it's kind of this murky area where it's not really clear from the story what happened. It's clear that Jacob thought that he had the right to leave, or that he needed to leave, and Laban disagreed. Laban looked at his daughters and all the herd as his. Even if Jacob took care of it, it was his property. Basically, it kind of seems like Laban expected that if Jacob wanted to leave, he could leave, but he'd have to leave Laban's daughters there and all the cattle that he raised. So
He also was afraid of his brother.
Oh, Jacob was?
Yes,
Yeah.
don't you think so?
Oh, he was clearly afraid of his brother. Yeah. So that's the story we'll go in today. But before we go to that story, we have, in chapter 32, we talked about,
read through the
we talked,
meeting.
yeah, we talked through how at the beginning of 32, he sees God's army. He sees like a spiritual army and realizes that God's army is with him. And it's between the story of his encounter with Laban, and they're making a covenant, and his encounter with Esau. So I talked about last time, it's not really clear whether that's meant to say he sees God's army and then he realizes, oh, God was here protecting me against Laban, or if he's seeing the army as he's about to face Esau, and he's supposed to think, oh, God's army is going with me as I go to face Esau. But remember, he prayed to God when he was about to come up against Esau in chapter 32, because God was the one who called him to leave up here and go back home. God said, go back home. And do you remember when Jacob left originally, when he was fleeing from Esau, he prayed to God because at Bethel, he had been at the town of Bethel, which is down here. I'll actually show you where Bethel is because it's going to come up today. Sorry, I'm getting this close. Bethel is down here. Right there. See where that little circle is? This is where Bethel is. So originally when he fled from his brother Esau, he was at Bethel, and that's where he had the dream and he saw the stairway into heaven. And God called him to be in covenant with him, and he said, if God will provide me with food and shelter and clothing and brings me back to my father's land in peace, then he will be my God and I will be his. Remember? And so when he prays to God here, he calls on God to protect him. And this is kind of the test to see whether or not God is going to bring him home in peace. And so we just saw that he has God's army with him. And then you all read the story. You know, as he's coming up, he realizes that Esau is coming with what?
400 men.
Basically an army, 400 men.
Yeah.
So it's not looking good. It, like, from Jacob's perspective, it looks like Esau remembers what Jacob did 20 years ago when he stole everything from him. So he does this smart thing where he splits up his company into different groups and he sends them ahead. And right before he encounters Esau, he has this really interesting experience where he wrestles with a man in the night, right? And all it ever says is that he wrestled with a man. Right? Does it ever tell him, am I misremembering? Does it ever say that it was an angel or that it was God?
30, he says, for I have seen God face to face and my life is preserved.
Right. So I think that's the only indicator in the story that he's wrestled with God. Jacob is clear he has wrestled with God. That's a good question. What do you all think?
What was the point? The name got changed.
Okay.
Well,
You mean, what was the point of wrestling with God?
Well, I mean, you could ask the question lots of different ways. Why right then? Why did God wrestle with him then? Or why did this happen at this point in the story? What's the significance? I mean, you're right. He changes his name, and that's significant, Sharon, because remember, when Abram's name was changed to Abraham, that was a big deal. And it was an indication of God fulfilling the covenant. That was I think in chapter 17, when right before they finally had Isaac, their first son, the promised heir. So, and remember, names have been a big deal since Genesis chapter 11, when they build the Tower of Babel, and they do it to make a name for themselves. And so God destroys them, but then he, or scatters them, and then he speaks to Abram, calls Abram, and he promises him that he will make his name great. You guys remember that? In chapter 12, he promised to make Abram's name great, and he literally makes his name great because he becomes like a blessed father, I think is what Abram means, something like that. And then Abraham makes it like father of nations or something like that. So his name literally, the meaning changes to reflect God's promise that he would make nations of him. And so when Abram's name changed to Abraham and Sarai to Sarah, it's a big deal. It's an indication of God's fulfilled covenant. Here we have a name change, and his name changes to Israel, which means, do you guys know?
he who wrestles.
He who wrestles or strives. Mm-hmm. So one who has power with God. Okay. So yeah, one interpretation I've heard, I mean, one, it's just kind of descriptive. He wrestled with God, and so God called him the one who wrestles, you know. But also, he's been wrestling for a while. Think about it. In the womb, he came out of the womb holding his brother's heel, right? Guy's been wrestling since the womb. And he came out, and then he, like, you know, basically wrestled his brother for his birthright and his blessing and kind of tricked him out of it. He wrestled with Laban and ended up kind of out-tricking Laban, you know, because Laban got him for 20 years, but finally Jacob got out from under Laban and got everything, got to take his wives, children, grandchildren, and everything with him. He didn't have grandchildren after 20 years, I'm sure. But, you know, so he keeps,
Physically,
right,
possible.
it's possible. So he wrestles with everybody along the way, and he ends up basically getting what he wants every time. Here in this story, it's really weird. He won't let go of God, and God is saying to him, let go of me. Such a weird story for us who think of God as all powerful. We just think God would be like, get off me, flee, like swat him away and he'd be done. But it's this really interesting story. It's not like, I don't think we're supposed to. What do you guys imagine in this wrestling match between Jacob and God? What do you see?
I think it's about submission.
Mm-hmm.
That, the talk about him seeing God's army
Mm-hmm.
after his encounter with Laban is, I think God's showing him, I was there fighting the spiritual battle with Laban, because it doesn't really make sense that Laban gave up, does it?
I think it's quite surprising, yeah.
It doesn't make sense. Why didn't it come to violence? Why did Jacob even survive it?
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't make sense. So there was something happening, I think, in the spiritual realm that changed the dynamic, that changed his heart. And so now he's coming up to confront Esau. He's strategizing. He's trying to get deceptive again. And I think right here, when he wrestles with God, it's like, you're gonna, you've been struggling. You've been struggling all your life to get this for yourself. It's time to submit.
Yeah.
I think.
I like that. I like that interpretation. I think that's good. Yeah. And I think we've got another clue in the text that I think can help us understand this. So we'll read that. But I guess the rest of the story, there's kind of a couple of aspects to the story that we should just note. God knocks his hip out of socket. And then there's a little note about that's why Israelites don't eat that part of the body anymore. And it says he went from there with a limp. So, God shows that he has power over him, because it seems like he pretty easily knocks his hip out of joint, or out of whatever. But that's one aspect. And then Jacob requires a blessing of him. So he knows he's wrestling with God, and he's wrestling him for the blessing, which makes sense. That's kind of what he did with Esau too, right? He wrestled with Esau to get his blessing. He keeps trying to get his blessing by wrestling. And then he asks for God's name. And in this story, God doesn't give him his name, does he? Does he tell, what does he say in your translation? You mustn't ask. That's interesting. What do your translations say? That's verse
29.
Mm-hmm.
Mine just says, why is it that you ask about my name?
Mm-hmm.
And he blessed him there.
Jacob asked him and said, tell me, I pray to you thy name. And he said, wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there.
Yeah. So in our translations, it's a question. Why are you asking about my name? In yours, they kind of take it as you mustn't ask.
And then it follows with that he realizes I've seen God face to face.
Right.
So he must have realized it.
Sure.
Without him replying.
Well, it seems like, yeah, okay, so you could understand Jacob's question in two ways. Jacob could just be asking, who are you? Just a general question. Who are you? Are you a normal man? Are you an angel? Are you God? And he just realizes that he's been wrestling with God without God answering. Or he is asking for God's specific name. Perhaps, because remember, we talked today that God has an actual name. Yahweh, right? And his name, Yahweh, has already appeared in the story many times. Seems like Abraham knew him as Yahweh. So, so it's a fascinating question. He asks him, and later, God will actually, God doesn't tell him his name. Later, he tells him, I am God Almighty. But let's move on. I think, just notice, he says, for I have seen God face to face, right? And that's a big deal. You could take that metaphorically, that he just means I had an experience with God. There's a lot of people today who think God is mostly a metaphor, or don't think that you could actually see God. But here he seems to, he wrestled literally with somebody and saw him, okay? And to see God is a big deal in the Bible. Most people are afraid that when they see God, they'll die. This is the kind of story in the Bible where normally someone is like, I've seen God, I'm going to die. But he's been wrestling with them. It's just crazy. So chapter 33, they have this encounter with Esau. And would someone read...
Why would Esau come with 400 men?
Right. Well, so the easy interpretation is that Esau came ready for battle.
Yeah.
And because he's, and we would assume because he's still angry that Jacob stole his birthright and blessing.
I think neither one knew what the other one was going to do.
Yeah, okay, so maybe...
Or he had heard how prosperous
Yeah.
Jacob had been.
Yeah, so maybe he was worried that Jacob was coming in with an army himself, and he was just coming ready to defend himself. We don't know. Or it could be that he came thinking he was going to beat Jacob up, and then Jacob's... Or you could say maybe Jacob's little strategy worked, and slowly as Esau passed all of Jacob's family and everything, his heart kind of softened, and he decided he wasn't going to attack his brother. Or you might consider Ruth's interpretation that God has been doing work spiritually. God has been fighting a spiritual battle so that by the time Esau gets to him, the battle's already been won. So that Esau is not going to do what he set out to do anymore. I don't think the story explains to us, but maybe we'll find some information that helps us understand. But first of all, I'm just going to read. Well, someone read verse 4 through verse 11 for me, please.
But Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. And he lifted his eyes and saw the women and children and said, Who are these with you? So he said, The children whom God has graciously given your servant. Then the maidservants came near, they and their children, and bowed down. And Leah also came near with her children, and they bowed down. And afterwards Joseph and Rachel came near, and they bowed down. Then Esau said, What do you mean by all this company which I met? And he said, These are to find favor in the sight of my Lord. But Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself. And Jacob said, No, please, if I have now found favor in your sight, then receive my present from my hand, inasmuch as I have seen your face as though I had seen the face of God, and you were pleased with me. Please take my blessing that is brought to you, because God has dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough. And so he urged him, and he took it.
Okay. So one, it is kind of a beautiful image, right? Jacob has been preparing for the worst, but his brother runs and embraces him, and they have a tearful reunion. Kind of reminds me of the prodigal of the parable son, wherein the father is watching for his son and joyfully embraces him. And I wouldn't make a whole lot of that. I mean, I wonder if Jesus, had that image in his head when he told the parable. I don't know. It's kind of different, brother to brother versus father and son. But what I find interesting is he says to him, to see your face is like seeing the face of God, right after the story when he wrestled God and saw him face to face. To me, that's more than a coincidence. He's just wrestled God and said, I've seen God face to face. And then he sees Esau and he says, seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. So what in the world does he mean by that? What does he mean? Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God.
This says, I was as frightened of you as though approaching God. So he was afraid. It's just, I guess, saying how afraid he was of what was going to happen.
Okay, yeah. So in that, they have kind of interpreted and helped you to understand one possible thing of what that would mean when it says seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. And their interpretation is to say, I have been afraid of you as I would be afraid of seeing God face to face, which is possible.
Here's another interpretation in my commentary. Jacob presented his gifts to his brother as if they were gifts to God. In this manner, he reenacted Abraham's gift to Melchizedek and indeed fulfilled his vow to the Lord.
Oh, interesting. Making a connection with Melchizedek. I don't know. I mean, it's similar in that someone's giving a gift to another person in a sense. Although with Abraham, it's a tithe, and it's like it's in the
Right.
context of calling Melchizedek a priest, and he's giving it to him as like a
Like
worship.
he's giving it to God.
Yeah, in a sense. And here in this story, maybe I see. I guess I wouldn't go too far with the Melchizedek thing, but he does come to Esau, and everybody bows before Esau. I mean, the whole family, including Jacob and Rachel. And he does call him my Lord, and that's not meant to say Lord like we mean Lord God. It's just like, back then, if someone was a master or powerful, they would call them Lord. But he seems to be showing him a lot of deference and kind of saying, like, my life is in your hand. Yeah, and maybe he's seeing in Laban, I do think the parallel is supposed to be pretty close. He's seeing in Laban that, in Esau, thank you, in Esau, that Esau has power of life or death over him.
I'll read you what my Bible says. It says, Jacob being accepted by his brother was more evidence of his acceptance with God. God had forgiven him. Now Esau was forgiving him. The brothers are reconciled to each other because of God's graciousness.
Oh, interesting. They put it in terms of forgiveness. So that means they're interpreting Jacob's wrestling with God as a story of God forgiving Jacob. It's interesting. I'd never thought of it as like that being an instant, like that when God and Jacob wrestled, that God ended up forgiving Jacob. I wonder if there's much to that.
What Ruth said about submission, that makes a lot of sense to me. That's why they wrestled so long.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, but just to also make sure we pay attention, it's not that the wrestling ends when God gives up, which is what's scandalous to me. When God gives up. So in the actual wrestling, it's not Jacob who says, let me go. It's God who says, let me go. And now I don't think it's because like Jacob has God pinned. No. I think it's more like Jacob is like clinging for dear life, and he just won't let go. And God's like, come on, get off of me, That's, I guess, what fits more with my understanding of God. But like, I think I like Ruth's interpretation best of what we've been talking about. But I also just want to make sure we know that in the story of the wrestling, there isn't a literal submission in which Jacob says, I submit. He kind of is annoyingly obstinate and makes sure he gets what he wants, Let's go back to the seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. Right after that, he's in my translation, he says, for truly to see your face is like seeing the face of God. With such favor have you received me. And Ruth's was slightly different. What was it? With such favor, that part.
And you were pleased with me.
And you were pleased with me. So I think that offers another way to interpret what he's just said. You're seeing your face is like seeing the face of God. And then it's kind of like he might be saying, because similar to when I saw the face of God, you both favored me. Like I got a blessing from God, and now seeing you face to face, you have chosen to bless me. So Esau comes and welcomes him and greets him and embraces him and chooses to bless Jacob rather than to do him harm. And in that way, he's acted similarly to God. And a situation which could have easily resulted in Jacob's death, wrestling with God, could have easily died. Coming up against Esau with his 400 men, could have easily died. But in both situations, when he could have easily died, he receives favor and blessing instead. And so he's seeing this parallel between his experience with God and his experience with Esau. That's the best I know how to make sense of that. But what I like about Ruth's interpretation is that it seems like Jacob's attitude has changed. Although he's really, stubborn still, and although he seems to still be strategizing, he seems to be coming humbly. He doesn't come up against Esau ready for battle, and he doesn't come up ready to argue. He comes ready to,
bestow gifts.
Yeah, he's giving gifts, and he's coming and bowing in front of his brother. So it seems to show to me that he's learned humility. over the last 20 years at some point. Although he's gotten blessed, although he's gotten what he wanted, he hasn't come out of it, proud, or, God seems to have humbled Jacob over the last 20 years. So they then separate, and we're not going to read everything, but maybe we can I'll read real quickly at the end of chapter 33. And Jacob came safely to the city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, on his way from Padan Aram, and he camped before the city. And from the sons of Hamor, Shechem's father, he bought for 100 pieces of money the piece of land on which he had pitched his tent. There he erected an altar and called it El Elohe Israel. And so what that means is God, the God of Israel. El means God in Hebrew.
But they didn't stay in Canaan.
No, they're still in. So
where's Shechem? Is that?
Yeah, he came.
It's a
I'll show you
little
real
north.
quick. So he came down here first. He wrestled God over in Penuel over here. And then he went to Sukkot first. I don't think we talked about, that was in the paragraph before. But Jacob journeyed to Sukkot and built for himself a house and made booths. There's actually a Jewish festival called Sukkot. It's the festival of booths. So that's where it comes from. So he basically comes down from the north, Jacob does, and meets Esau somewhere around here. And then he goes, or somewhere around here, I guess, because he meets God and wrestles with God in Penuel. Then he goes to Sukkot, then he crosses the Jordan and comes to Shechem up here, this northernmost town.
Okay.
So that is in Canaan. He's in the promised land.
This is supposed to be the land
That God's promised, yes. This is what will become
He
Israel.
doesn't stay there?
He doesn't stay there. He will move on. But for now, he's stopped in Shechem. Are you okay, Francis? Okay. Okay. We can get you water if we need. I wasn't as nice to you earlier, Diana. I'm sorry. But you were taking care of yourself. So yeah, he will move on from Shechem. But first we've got this story in Shechem, which is really messed up. Yes. So, and notice, Shechem seems to be the name of the town and the name of the son in the story who rapes Dinah or Dinah. I also don't think we're going to read the story do you remember the story? Basically, Shechem, the son of Hamor, comes and he rapes Dinah or Dinah. And that's a shameful thing to do. It brings shame to the whole family and on Dinah of all people, or Dinah. I'm not sure how you say her name in Hebrew. And at first, Jacob and the sons agree to make a covenant with Hamor and Shechem and all their people, right? But what's the one condition that they give to Hamor and his sons? They have to be circumcised. And why do they have to be circumcised?
To be a part of them.
So basically they come into the land and they're making a covenant. And I don't know if you remember our conversations about covenants. There are kind of two different covenants back there. There were parity treaties where you're basically saying we're equals and we're going to be like brothers to each other. We're going to cooperate and we're going to share our resources with each other. And then there was a suzerain vassal treaty or covenant where you have one that has more power and one that's called the vassal, and they serve the other group that's more powerful. So I'm not sure what's going on here, but it seems to me more likely that it's a suzerain vassal because Israel and his sons make the demands. They say, if you're going to have a covenant with us, then you've got to join into our covenant. You've got to be circumcised. And they agree to. So that tells me that Israel and his sons have more power in the circumstance. I'm not sure. So they enter into covenant with God's people, and the circumcision is the sign of Israel's covenant with God, with Yahweh. And what's really mean about this is, the sons do this, and it seems like they do it intentionally, not planning on following through, because they let the guys circumcise themselves, and then while they're down for the count for a few days, they go and they kill all the men, right?
This was their plan.
Yes, right. So it seems like they were deceptive. And I just want to point out again that deception has been running through the whole story of Genesis. People are deceiving each other all the time. And it starts with the snake in the garden. So I think because the snake is the first one to bring deception, every time we see humans deceiving one another, we're supposed to kind of go, I don't think this is good. So on the one hand, we read the story of Dinah and we think, well, yeah, I would kill somebody for doing that to my sister. Or at least I'd want to kill someone for doing that to my sister or my daughter. I mean, part of us, I think, I don't know if you guys are like me, I read this and I read Jacob as kind of a wimp. I'm kind of frustrated with Jacob because his daughter just got dishonored and raped, and he agrees to make a covenant with them.
Where was Jacob? I think Jacob, he wasn't being like the head of the family like he should have been, was he?
He doesn't seem like a very strong leader here, right? And in fact, when the story ends, he gets angry at his sons. Why? At the end of chapter 34.
Because he went out and took all the blocks.
Mm-hmm.
They've made him stink.
He said his sons have made them stink. He says, "You have brought trouble on me by making me odious, making me stink, to the inhabitants of the land." Basically, and he says, "My numbers are few, and if they gather themselves against me and attack me, I shall be destroyed, both I and my household." So he's afraid. Isn't that kind of weird? First of all, God delivers him from Laban, and he sees God's army. Then he delivers him from Esau with 400 men. And he says, seeing your face is like the face of God. God's favor has been with him, defended him. He's come back into the land with peace, and still he's afraid of people. It seems like he's not getting the point there. And so on the one hand, I think we're supposed to kind of be looking at Jacob and thinking, dang it, Jacob still doesn't really fully get it. But and of course we sympathize with the sons of Israel who are upset, because their sister's been dishonored. But it also seems pretty clear that they have done wrong because they have been deceptive. And at the end of Genesis, when Israel is giving his final words to his sons, he curses I think it's Levi and Simeon, who end up going out and are the ones who went out and killed all the men. In fact, it's really interesting. I'm going to just...
Why did they kill all of them? I don't understand the purpose of that. Oh, because all of them.
For revenge. Yeah, I mean, seems like they went a little overboard.
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. So it doesn't seem... You would think, just to be fair, if they were trying to be just, they would just kill Shechem.
An eye for an eye.
An eye for an eye. Right, which you notice that law comes later. And many people have pointed out, when God gives the law, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, the point is to try to limit humans in their vengeance, because humans have a problem of making it worse. Oh, you hurt me? I'm going to hurt you so bad you never want to hurt me again. And then the other person says, oh yeah, you hurt me, so I'm going to hurt you so bad you never want to hurt me again. And we kind of multiply the pain. And God is saying, no, here's a limit, a cap. If someone does this much bad to you, you can only do this much bad to them. You can't make it worse. And I think we see the reason for that. There's already in the story of Genesis, we've had, I think, a few stories where a person reacted to something wrong done to them with something much worse. Yeah. So I think
one of the things my commentary points out too is that Jacob rebuked his sons for their terrible behavior because they did it in the name of the Lord.
Interesting. Let's read that.
It's pointing to verse 30 and 31.
30 and 31.
Which I'm not sure it really says that, but that's the commentary about it.
Fascinating. Yeah, I wonder where they get that from, because it
Maybe
doesn't
they just
say
bought
anything. And this is why your commentaries in your Bible can be really helpful. And a lot of time, your commentaries are put together by a scholar or multiple scholars who work together. And sometimes it's really good. And they might have a really good reason for saying that. I don't see why they say that immediately.
Well, did they do it in the name of the Lord when they took
Maybe they
action?
did. Let's see.
Why would they say that you've made me stink among all the people of the land if they were doing it in the name of the Lord? That would not.
You're saying that doesn't really fit together?
Yeah, if they were doing it in the name of the Lord, why would you say it?
Yeah. Yeah, I don't. Let's see. Let's see.
Dinah was already in the guy's house. Maybe she wanted to be there.
Yeah, it's interesting in this story, we don't really hear Dinah's experience. It seems clear to everybody that she has been shamed, But it's also clear that he did rape her. It wasn't
Consensual.
it was not consensual. That's very clear. The language is slightly indirect, but it's pretty clear from the story that she was
But
raped.
she had gone where she wasn't supposed to go.
Let's see. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to visit the women of the land. And when Shechem, the son of Hamor the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, he seized her and lay with her and humbled her. And that language in my translation, lay with her and humbled her, the humbled part is what's letting you know that it wasn't good. I mean, maybe there's one way of, is that what your commentary says, that she went where she wasn't supposed to?
She left the safety of the family home to find other young women.
Yeah, so, I mean, it does seem reasonable to say, in that ancient world, women were under the protection of their household. And if you left a certain area, you were, I think, putting yourself in danger.
You don't go by yourself.
Right, so it does seem like she went by herself, could be, and she went into a land where another guy was a prince of that land. And sadly, it was somewhat normal in the ancient world, I think, that if a king or a prince wanted something, he would just grab it. He would just grab it, take it. So, like the story of David and Bathsheba, when he didn't go and go onto Bathsheba's roof himself. He sent servants and had her brought to them. And his servants didn't go, "What? We've never heard of such a thing." No, they saw a king behaving like many kings in the world. God had even told Moses, had given laws to Moses, that the kings of Israel were not to act like other kings in taking multiple wives. And basically, they weren't supposed to take people's stuff from them. And so David, in that moment, when he takes Bathsheba, he's acting like a normal king, taking what he wants, because he's the most powerful guy in the land. And here we have a situation that is not excusable, but it might have been somewhat normal, that someone crosses into this prince's or this king's property or his area where he is in control, and he takes what he wants. And think about it. When Abraham went into Egypt and when he went into Abimelech's territory, he was afraid that they were going to take his wife and kill him in taking her. So there does seem to be reason, even within the biblical story, to think when you're going on into somebody else's country where another king is in charge, you got to be careful, because it could result in the king taking what he wants. So she does seem to go in a dangerous place. She's going by herself, and she's going into territory where this guy is ruling. But it's still clear. This is actually really interesting. I was just noticing this. Normally, Genesis doesn't tell us how to interpret the story. It doesn't say, and what this person did was bad. But it does in this story. So look at verse 7. Yeah, verse 7. The sons of Jacob came in from the field, and when they heard it, and the men were indignant and very angry, because he had wrought folly in Israel by lying with Jacob's daughter, for such a thing ought not to be done. This is the narrator speaking, saying this kind of thing shouldn't be done. That's very rare. So the biblical author is letting you know we're supposed to interpret this as a really, really bad thing that Shechem did to Dinah.
Do you think Jacob was thinking about going into taking their offer or their deal?
It seems all the indications are that Jacob was ready to just make a covenant with them and be at peace.
So if he had done that, it said Jacob had before him the opportunity for land, intermarriage, and a bride price of his choosing.
Yeah, because normally in a marriage, there was a bride price, like the father of the bride would pay the new husband to take his wife, or his daughter. It's like a dowry. So yeah, what they're saying is they're just using kind of logic about the culture to say, for Jacob, there's a huge benefit here, because if they accept this marriage and this covenant, then they'll be at peace, they'll be richer, they'll be, safer, and yeah, they'll be richer and safer, and but that's imagining what his motives were. At the end, Jacob is upset because he feels like they are now endangered, like the neighbors might kill them. So it does seem like his main concern was safety.
Rolling back to whether this was done in the name of the Lord.
Okay.
A little bit earlier, the commentary says when it's talking about the uncircumcised, Jacob's sons took the symbol of their holy faith and used it as a weapon against their foes. And maybe that's where they got that idea.
I do okay, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah, because the circumcision was the sign of their covenant with Yahweh, right?
Right.
And so when they made those guys get circumcised as a strategy to then kill them, they turned something that was holy into something that was murderous. So they didn't directly do it in the name of the Lord. That, at least there's no record of them like running into the village and saying, in the name of Yahweh, and then killing all the guys. But by getting them circumcised, they were associating those people with their God, Yahweh, and then they used it to kill him. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. I like that. So I'm glad you chased that down. So then let's chapter 25 is pretty
35
is pretty important. Yeah.
You're not going back to 25, are you?
No, did I say 25?
Yeah.
Oh, I was like, yeah, everybody, you can repeat what I'm saying. 35. 35.
I have one more question for you.
Okay.
This refers us back to Deuteronomy 7:3, but it said if they were circumcised, then they would be converted, and then it would be all right. And in 7:3 it says in Deuteronomy, nor shall you make marriages with him. You shall not give your daughters to their sons, or take their daughter for your son. So if they were circumcised, then I think they would be Jewish then.
Okay, yeah, so this brings up multiple points. Yes, by bringing them into the circumcision, they're bringing them into covenant with Yahweh as well. So, whether that was not their intention. Their intention was to kill them, it seems.
Oh, okay.
Their intention...
Well, they really did.
Was to make them weak. Yeah.
Now, it could... I haven't read the story very thoroughly today. It might be possible to read the story as, at first, they went along with it, and then, once the guys were circumcised, they were like, nah, let's not do this. Let's go kill them all. And, maybe they changed their mind, but it seems, from my memory, like they seem to have planned to use this as an occasion to kill them. So at least from their perspective, when they got Shechem and his father and their tribe to be circumcised, it was just a strategy to kill them. But effectively, when they got circumcised, they were bringing them into the covenant. And that would have made them a part of God's people. And we already know from the story before this that God doesn't want them intermarrying with local people in Canaan. Remember, that was an issue with Esau. This same Jacob's brother Esau, he first married two women who were from Canaan, and it said that their wives, I think they said their wives were odious to Isaac and Rebekah. The parents did not like them. And so Esau then marries another wife from Ishmael, from his line, which doesn't really make it better. So whereas Jacob, goes up to Haran to marry somebody who's in the family. So up until now in the story, it's been a big emphasis to keep marriage within the family and to not marry the local people. So when we see Jacob making a marriage agreement with the local Canaanites, I think we're supposed to be going, you're not supposed to be doing this. You're not supposed to be marrying the locals. Also, yeah, there's multiple times throughout the Old Testament where God makes it clear that if they intermarry with other tribes, it will bring them problems. That those other tribes will become thorns in their side. And almost every time they do. It becomes a big problem later on down. But also there is a law that is given to Moses that if someone rapes a woman, then they have to get married. We haven't gotten this law yet because we're in Genesis, not in Exodus or Leviticus. But God says if a man rapes a woman, then he has to marry her. And that's mainly for justice sake, because it would be even worse and more wicked if a man raped a woman and then abandoned her, because she would be shamed and she wouldn't probably be able to marry another man. Other men wouldn't want to marry her, and she wouldn't be provided for. So she'd be a social outcast who wasn't provided for, and then she might have to raise a child on her own. So that'd be terrible. So basically, God puts a law in place that says if you rape a woman, you're going to have to marry her. And that's supposed to help men know that they can't just rape a woman because they want to and then get away with it. They're going to have to then take care of the woman. So,
and there's your poetic justice, right? Because they're going to pay the rest of their life.
hopefully. But that's, so again, we haven't received this law yet, but in the story when Shechem rapes Dinah, it's kind of like this terrible evil has happened. How do we now make the best out of it? It's a pretty messy situation. So you have multiple things going on. Now we have an intermarriage with the local Canaanite. That's not good. But also, Dinah's now been shamed, and she has to be like honored and taken care of. And how best do they like protect her honor and take care of her?
We don't hear anything else about Dinah. I mean, that's all we know about Dinah.
That's true. That's true.
Okay.
But
It could be.
also says, I mean, back in verse 3, Shechem's soul was strongly attracted to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob's, and he loved her.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, he obviously forced himself on her at an inappropriate time. But it wasn't that he just saw her as an object exactly. He wanted a relationship with her.
Yeah, it seems like he didn't want to get rid of her. He wanted to marry her.
Right.
He did a terrible, terrible, terrible thing. But again, we don't get her perspective.
Right.
We don't know if she was up for it or not.
Well, seems that she was not.
Oh, not up. Well, we know
Yeah.
that she was raped, and that seems to imply that she did not want that. But whether or not she was willing to be married, we don't know if she had anything to say about
Right.
that.
She probably wouldn't have
It's
had anything to say
yeah,
generally.
right. Yeah, it wouldn't have mattered whether she wanted to or not.
But she was at Shechem's house.
Right.
Does that
She was
mean
rescued.
anything?
She was rescued from
I mean, was she being held there, or she wanted to be there?
Well,
I
it seems
don't know
like
that.
well,
That's dumb
it
question.
seems like when they agree to, let them be circumcised, they're agreeing for her to be married to him. And since he's already raped her, it seems to be like they're basically already acting like they're married. They're not waiting for a marriage ceremony. It seems like she's already gone to live with him.
I think Jacob messed up on this one. He didn't do like he should have.
Yeah,
He wasn't.
Just one of the times.
yeah, and I'm not sure what the right response would have been. If it would have just been to kill Shechem or what, or to allow her to be married to him, but not let them
They were going to have to hurry.
circumcise.
Yeah.
We're gonna have to hurry. Well, you gotta quit asking me questions and saying things in.
6 minutes.
Tell me to hurry. Good night. So we are in chapter 35, and I actually preached about this, so I don't know that we need to say a whole lot, but they come to Bethel. So he's coming back to that place where God offered to make the covenant with him, where he saw the stairway into heaven, right? And he tells all of his people to put away any foreign gods they have, which up to this point, God hasn't given them the 10 commandments and said, you can't worship any other gods. It seems that Jacob just kind of knows and understands they're now going into covenant with Yahweh. And so that requires an exclusive loyalty to Yahweh. I don't know how else to explain that. It's just that Jacob seems to understand we're entering into covenant. And that was normal in a suzerain vassal treaty. If a smaller country went into a covenant with a bigger country, you couldn't make a covenant with all the big countries around you. If they entered into a covenant with Egypt, that was an exclusive relationship. Egypt, you're our only covenant partner. We're not making any covenants with these other empires around us. And so I think it is a part of the ancient world. If a people had a covenant with a god, then that was their god. And that's what Jacob is doing. He's saying, you guys can't have any other gods. So then someone read verses 5 to 15.
Those words are incomprehensible.
Okay, I'll read it. And as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were round about them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. See, that's really interesting. Pause right there. Jacob was afraid that all the people around them were going to kill them. But immediately we find out that God put a terror on them around them. So again, God is protecting him, and Jacob's seed doesn't really to really get it. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, and he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brother. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel, so the name of it was called Alon Bakuth. And Alon Bakuth means oak of weeping. So let me make it just a couple of things. So Bethel has another name, Luz, and it seems that probably Luz was the original name, but because of Jacob's experience at Bethel, he renames it Bethel, which means house of God. In Hebrew, the word Beth means house. Bethlehem is house of bread. Bethel is house of God. El means God. And so when it says, and there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, God, house of God, is, I think, let's see, how about that? My Bible says God of Bethel, God of the house of God. So, interestingly, this is the same location where God revealed himself to Abraham at first in chapter 12, if I remember correctly. Let me look real quick and make sure I'm not lying. I could be wrong. Am I wrong? Let's see. Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. Then Yahweh appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So he built there an altar to Yahweh who had appeared to him. Thence he removed to the mountain on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to Yahweh and called on the name of the Lord. So it might not be in the exact same place, but Abram, in chapter 12, God appears to Abram right around Bethel, and Abram builds an altar to him there. Then 2 generations later, Jacob is basically in the same location, and he builds an altar to God. So verse 9. God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Padan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be called your name. So his name was called Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations shall come from you, and kings shall spring from you. The land which I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone, and he poured out a drink offering on it and poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him, Bethel. And you'll notice there seems to be some repetitions going on there. It kind of seems to repeat God's renaming him, because God had already renamed him Israel when they wrestled. And it seems to also retell the story of him naming the place Bethel. So I'm sure there are different theories about why this paragraph is here. I actually can pretty well guarantee you that there's a theory out there that scholars have had for quite a while that the Torah was kind of pieced together from different documents by different scribes, different editors. And it was kind of like edited together. They took all these different, like Moses wrote this, but then this other person over here wrote this, and this other person wrote this, and they all have kind of different perspectives. And so some editors and scribes came together and kind of put it all together in order and made it make sense. And so without looking, I can pretty well promise you that this chapter from verse 9 to verse 15, there are scholars who say, well, the reason why we have all this repetition is because this is material from a different source, from a different author, and they put it next to other material that was similar because it kind of belonged together, and they wanted to keep these two traditions alive. Another possibility is just that Moses or whoever wrote this, I'm very willing to believe it would be Moses, just wanted to give kind of a summary of what he had been talking, what had happened in the last couple of chapters. And so he kind of tells, and this is the end of a big arc, because this arc began when Jacob ran away from Esau. And he said, if I return to this place, I'll make my covenant with Yahweh. And so finally he's returned to that same place. in Bethel, and he's formalizing his covenant agreement with God.
So in verse 9, when it says, when Jacob came from Padan Aram,
That's this.
where is that?
Padan Aram is the region in the north where he was before.
Okay, from way up there.
Yeah, this is Padan Aram. You can even see it right there. Yeah, so Haran was the name of the town he was in, and Padan Aram was the region.
Okay.
So yeah.
So, yeah.
So it's kind of just summarizing the whole journey from up north down to the south again. And notice, I liked this point. I read it in a book recently. Almost anytime someone is building a city, it's a bad thing. Building of Babylon, the Tower of Babylon, it's a bad deal. Cain and his sons go and build cities, and it seems to be that's not a good thing. God then wipes out, floods the earth. Even in Egypt and Exodus, the Hebrew slaves, are made to build cities for Pharaoh, and that is you're supposed to kind of see that as like a wicked thing that's being caused. But I read a book this week where the author said, wicked people often build cities or like big buildings that God doesn't like in Genesis and Exodus. But God's faithful people tend to, when it talks about what they build, it tends to be like pillars or altars to God. And so I don't know how true that is across the board. But so far, when it's talked about Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, when they've built anything, it's been an altar or a pillar to God. So God's people build things in order to worship God, whereas other people build things in order to exalt themselves and make themselves secure. There's often kind of this interplay between God's people who are learning to trust God for their security, right? Jacob is needing to learn that God is defending him with his army, and he's putting fear on all the nations around. So they're being challenged to learn that God is protecting them, whereas the other nations try to protect themselves by building big cities and armies and things like that. Also, just last things, and we'll close. We're only a couple minutes over. Deborah, in verse 8, it mentioned that Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, died. And you kind of think, like, why do I care? Why do I care if someone's nurse died? Have we talked about her at all yet? And we haven't. I don't think I think she might have been mentioned one other time. I was looking this up because I was thinking, this is weird. Why do we hear about Deborah?
Well, she wasn't even with him, was she? I mean,
Well, she had apparently...
With his parents. I mean...
Let's see.
Jacob weren't they different places or not?
It seems to assume that Deborah is in Jacob's camp. Let me see. Well, because she was buried in Bethel, so she seems to have gone with Jacob and his family.
Okay, and she left
So
Rebecca then.
Let me see. Okay, so when Rebecca sends Jacob away to get away from Esau, she tells him to go to the north until your brother's anger against you subsides and he forgets what you did to him. Then I will send and get you from there. Why should I be bereaved of you both? So I think some people have reasoned that maybe the reason why Rebecca's nurse is with Jacob is because Rebecca sent for them, and she sent her nurse to go and get Jacob to come back. But we don't know. We don't know why her nurse is with them. We were never told how she got there with them. But what's interesting, and I want to point your attention to, is we never actually get a story of how Rebecca dies. Later on in chapter 49, it just says that Leah was buried in the same place as Isaac and Rebecca. But we never find out how Rebecca died, whether she died. We will hear a little bit more about Isaac, but we never hear about Rebecca again. And some people thought that maybe that's because Rebecca kind of ran afoul of God when she did all this cheating, deceptive stuff. And so the story leaves her out. Her death seems to be unimportant to the story. But it's fascinating that here it mentions her nurse. And then after, at the end of this chapter, it mentions that it talks about Rachel's death. Rachel dies giving birth to Benjamin, the last of the 12 sons of Israel. And she calls him Ben-Oni, which means son of my sorrow, which is kind of a sad name. It could mean, I think it could go one of two ways. Either she's saying like, this son has killed me, or she could just be saying, like she had been sorrowful her whole life because she had been barren. And so now she's given a second son. Her first son was Joseph. Now her second son is Benjamin. And so she's kind of saying like, this is the son that, maybe like provides the solution to my sorrow kind of thing, like answers my sorrow. But apparently Jacob didn't like that name because he renamed him Benjamin. And Benjamin means,
Son of my right hand.
yeah, son of the right hand, or son of the south is another way of understanding it. So we should understand that we're being given a lot of indications that this is the end of a section or a part of the narrative, because multiple deaths have happened. They're back in the land, and we're getting the last of the 12 sons, and Rachel has died, his favorite wife. So this is kind of the end of this section of Genesis, and Jacob buries her there, which is fascinating. I want to go back later because it seems like he's burying her there, but later on in the narrative it says she was buried somewhere else, so I'm confused. So then later it has a short story in verse 22. I'll just finish chapter 35. Verse 22, where it says that Reuben, the oldest son, went in and laid with his father's concubine, Bilhah. And we'll hear about that later, because that was a bad thing to do. He dishonored his father when he went and had relations with his father's concubine. And so then we get the naming of the 12 sons, and that's kind of, we've reached the end of that section. And then Jacob dies, and Esau and Jacob bury him. He dies full of days.
One last thing about Deborah, the nurse of Rebecca. Commentary says the Hebrew verb that's translated as died means had died. Deborah had already died, but at this point the family commemorated her death and buried her at Bethel.
Huh. Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I'd have to
look at that up. But that's kind of interesting. Maybe they were hauling her along, waiting for the appropriate time to bury her in the land.
Right. Yeah. Well, it later on when Jacob dies in Egypt, he tells his sons to bring his bones back and bury him in the land. So that's reasonable to think that maybe she had died earlier on, and then they were making sure to bury her there. Yeah. Any other last things? At the end it says Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre. So Isaac is still alive. That's in verse 27. Or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron. So on our map, we finally end up way down here in the south of what will later be Israel. And remember, when God appeared to Abraham at the beginning, he appeared to him by the oaks of Mamre. So that would have been in this region. And Hebron is a very important place. I told you guys in recent weeks that was where David was king first for 7 years. So these are all really significant places. You see them come up again and again. Bethel, Sukkot, Shechem, Mamre, Hebron. All of those place names come up all throughout the rest of the Torah and the Old Testament. So pay attention, because it's significant. So when we see Jacob come to Bethel and have these experiences, we're supposed to go, oh, that's the same place where Abraham had an encounter with God. And it's called House of God. And you notice that the story is told in ways like, in chapter 12, when Abram encountered God at Bethel, it called it Bethel. But this was the story in chapter 34, 22 chapters later, where the town is named Bethel. So sometimes the story is told, and it's not told in perfectly chronological order. We're hearing the place names that that we get.
Haven't yet been named.
Yeah, those names haven't yet been named, those things, but the story is being told so that Israelites who know the land and know those places will read it and say, like, oh, that was in Bethel. Because they know it as Bethel. They don't know it as Luz, the place it was called before that, probably. So anyways, just to make sure of that. Okay, well, sorry, not super sorry for going over 10 minutes, but I am sorry. I should honor your time.
We forgive you.
Oh, thank you. It's Sharon's fault. So, no, I'm just
Everyone
playing.
else is saying.
I'll get you back sooner or later.
All right, let me pray for us. Oh God, you are wonderful, and your word is so rich. There's so much to understand, so much that we still have yet to understand. So we look forward to future days of coming back to Genesis and learning more about you. And we thank you for these rich stories that you didn't just give us a book with a bunch of laws or instructions or boring things. You gave us a book filled with stories, beautiful stories of people who are like us, who are stubborn like us and kind of dull and slow like us, and who are confused and who are deceived, and God forbid, sometimes we're deceptive, Lord. Please help us to be more faithful than the people we're reading about, faithful to your covenant in Jesus, more obedient, more loving. Please, God, teach us to trust you for our security, unlike Jacob. Teach us to honor our words, unlike Jacob's sons. Teach us to honor the people around us and not take advantage of them. Help us, Lord, to be faithful to you in everything we do this week. In Jesus' name.
Amen.